I'm Debbie Fox, and I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and I'm a part of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium with Collaborative Solutions, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our HUD NOFA, our second HUD NOFA webinar series today on July 19th, 2018, with the Kentucky Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They will provide you all with an overview of their programmatic pieces around the HUD NOFA Continuum of Care application process, and they'll discuss our currently funded HUD Continuum of Care programs. On today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Maria Williams from the Pennsylvania Coalition and Mary O'Doherty and Andrea Miller from the Kentucky Coalition. And the goal of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium HUD NOFA series is to highlight the new opportunities and changes in this year's HUD NOFA that impacts domestic and sexual violence providers in their application process. And we'll be reviewing core components of the new $50 million DV bonus project for DV survivors. And the Kentucky and Pennsylvania Coalition will be providing a refresher on the different models and programmatic models that are a part of the Continuum of Care funding. We welcome your questions in the chat box and look forward to answering your questions. And I'll turn it over to Mary and Andrea at this time. Thank you all.
Good morning or good afternoon. So the goal of today's webinar is to discuss the importance of participating in your local continuum of cares. We want to highlight well-designed COC DV housing projects and provide tips to ensure that DV program is an integral part of your COC and your homeless service continuum. So we'll be sharing some examples of some effective models. We're going to be talking about KCADV's Rapid Rehousing Program, and we're also going to be laying the groundwork for some giving you some updates on the current HUD NOFA process and the forthcoming new $50 billion DV bonus. The $50 billion new DV bonus project, Rapid Rehousing Set Aside for victims of domestic violence. Okay, so the DV and the Housing Technical Assistance Consortium is made up of 4 federal agencies. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Program, which is a part of HHS, the Office of Violence Against Women, which is under DOJ, the Office for Victims of Crime, also a DOJ agency, and the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, which is a part of HUD. The consortium is comprised of 4 technical assistance providers: the National Alliance for Safe Housing, we call them NASH, Collaborative Solutions, Inc., the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. So everybody is really excited about the increases in HUD funding that are available. Overall, the new bill increased HUD program funding by $4.7 billion, or nearly by 11%. Included in that is $2.5 billion for homeless assistance grants and $375 million for housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, also known as HOPWA. For the first time, HUD is including funding for DV housing programs. This is very exciting, and it's really a tribute to the excellent lobbying and advocacy work that our advocates in DC and around the country have done. We have, for the first time, a domestic violence rapid rehousing set aside, and everybody's been calling it the $50 million DV bonus fund, and it's for rapid rehousing and supportive services for victims of domestic violence. There's also $80 million for a continued homeless youth initiative. So, Continuum of Cares can apply for up to 10% of their preliminary pro rata need, or a minimum of $50,000, whichever is greater, or a maximum of $5 million, whichever is less. So, and each continuum of care can create up to 3 DV bonus projects to serve survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So, every COC is going to be able to apply for funding for up to one of each of the following project types: permanent housing, rapid rehousing project, a joint transitional housing and permanent housing rapid rehousing project. We've shortened that to joint component projects, and also for supportive services only project, and that would be for coordinated entry. And Andrea is going to be talking to you a little bit about the permanent supportive housing rapid rehousing project, a project that we had that we started in Kentucky about 18 months ago. Okay, so as most of you know, domestic violence programs really, first and foremost, are dedicated to ensuring the safety and stability of survivors. That's our #1 mission and reason for being. After that, I'd argue that housing is the #1 need voiced by most survivors who show up at our programs. So it's really terrific that in the last year or so, so many resources have been dedicated to helping the DV community better understand HUD funding and how to obtain it. In Kentucky, the Domestic Violence Coalition here includes 15-member programs, and most of them have done a pretty good job of getting HUD funding. In fact, only one of our programs does not get HUD funding. But it's been a real journey to get to that point. So today I wanted to start by outlining just some of the issues that our programs have grappled with as they have provided housing services with HUD funding. Our focus on confidentiality and safety sometimes presents challenges for our funders, and you know, HUD is no different. I'm sure most folks on this call understand the challenges the DV field has faced with HUD's need for data collection, and we are all working hard to figure out how to do the best with that. So if you're going to have a HUD-funded project, you're going to need to have a comparable database so that you can report data in the aggregate, and that's a have-to. There's no way around that. Another consideration that's worth mentioning up front is that HUD has a focus on fast exits to permanent housing, and that's something that DV programs struggle with. The folks that we are working with, the families that we're working with, often need more time. Sometimes they need a lot more time. So that's an issue we'll talk a little bit more about. HUD also has a prioritization for chronically homeless. Long story short, programs must really must make a commitment to serving chronically homeless families if they want to maximize the points that are available through the HUD NOFA while they're competing for dollars. There's been a de-emphasis, as we all know, on transitional housing programs, and amazingly enough, there is still confusion over the Category 4 definition of homelessness. We have not, in Kentucky, struggled with this, but we've heard from DV providers in other states that there's confusion about this. But that is the definition of homelessness that most of our survivors fit under, the vast majority fit under. We're also still dealing with the evolution of the coordinated entry processes. I know that we've all experienced a great deal of change with coordinated entry over the last year. We'll be talking a bit more about that. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned from our experience in running a rapid rehousing program. We know that we need to, that the focus on rapid rehousing makes serving domestic violence survivors challenging sometimes, and often it's because, well, it's because there is a limit. With rapid rehousing, you can provide rental assistance for up to 24 months. And we know that the families that we work with often are going to need assistance for longer than many homeless service providers want to provide rapid rehousing assistance. And one of the main points that we talk about when we talk about our program is we provide rental assistance for 12 months, and we provide rental assistance for up to 24 months for at least for half of the, I think about half of the folks that we start serving, that we start helping with rapid rehousing. So you really, I think when you're using HUD funding to provide a rapid rehousing program for domestic violence survivors, should be ready to provide that homeless assistance for at least 12 months in order to run a successful program. We know that that so many of the survivors that we work with grew up in generational poverty, and they just need more intervention and more wraparound services. We know that there are systemic barriers that need to be addressed in addition to domestic violence. So those are just some of the considerations that you have to think about when you're working with HUD funding. I wanted to just spend a minute more talking about HUD's focus on faster exits from shelter. I'd argue that it's the most difficult obstacle we're dealing with. HUD's target is that homeless families move into housing 30 days after they've entered shelter. But we all know that oftentimes a survivor's safety is still in jeopardy 30 days after she's moved into shelter. So we've gotten some excellent guidance from our local HUD officials on this point. They've told us that it's just really important to remember that the 30-day target is a goal. It's a goal set by HUD as something for us to be moving toward. So I guess I'd argue that maybe a better way to think about this 30-day goal is that HUD wants us to be focused on reducing the time families stay in shelter, as opposed to getting them out of shelter in 30 days. Okay, so talking about the Continuum of Care now, Continuum of Care's, the Continuum of Care planning system was set up by HUD in 1996 to coordinate housing and services funding for homeless families and individuals. I hope that many of you are familiar with your local COCs. If you are, you know that they conduct the point and time counts of the homeless population, and they track programs that make up the homeless assistance programs. In Kentucky, we have 3 COCs. We have one that serves Louisville, our largest urban area, Lexington, the second largest urban area, and then the balance of state. And that balance of state includes 118 counties, every county except for those that include the 2 largest urban areas. So everything that we talk about on this webinar, or most everything, is really going to be reflecting the work that we've done with the balance of state. That's where all of the folks that we serve come from. One last point I wanted to make on this slide is that HUD gives COCs a lot of flexibility when it comes to setting up their funding processes. So you should know that every COC has its own grant scoring system. And you are, if you're participating in your COC, you have the ability to have some input and hopefully some impact on that. Part of the reason why the Kentucky DV programs have had some success in working with our with Kentucky Housing Corporation, which administers most of the HUD funding in our state, is that our domestic violence programs, most of them, or maybe I shouldn't say most of them, but many of them have been participating in an engaged way in our state COC process since it was established. Many of the executive directors of our programs were sitting around the table the first time HUD started talking about using a continuum of care process. So consequently, all of our programs but one have ESG grants, and several others have funding through the COC. We also, the coalition, also has a rapid rehousing grant. This is a program that we launched in December of 2016. We are currently providing services to about 70 families. Okay, next slide. Wanted to talk about the different project types and just have some important terms for everyone here to be familiar with. The first one you'll see is permanent housing. HUD's top priority is moving families into permanent housing, and there should be no confusion about that. HUD also has a permanent supportive housing project type. We have several in Kentucky. Actually, we have 2 of our programs run permanent supportive housing projects, and these projects are for clients with disabilities. And the useful and nice thing about permanent supportive housing projects is there's no limit on rental assistance. You don't have to deal with that 24-month limit that we talked about with rapid rehousing. Rapid rehousing, another project type. As I said, rental assistance is limited for up to 24 months. There's transitional housing. There's the transitional housing project type. We all know that HUD has de-emphasized transitional housing projects, which also provide assistance for up to 24 months. And then there's also the joint component project. Maria's going to talk to you in more detail about a joint component project. Last year was the first time that we were able to seek funding for joint component projects. And joint component projects allow communities to provide, in HUD's words, low barrier temporary housing while individuals and families are being quickly and seamlessly connected to permanent housing through a rapid rehousing intervention. So the way I look at the joint component project type is HUD is saying that it recognizes the importance of transitional housing as long as they see that programs are moving clients to permanent housing. Okay. If you guys can remember only one thing from this webinar, it is that your programs and services will really benefit if you participate in the Continuum of Care funding process. Participating in your Continuum of Care will give your program a chance to inform non-DV providers about your services, and it'll also give you a way to talk about important ideas like trauma-informed care and the voluntary services philosophy. The link between domestic violence and homelessness is so huge, and we all know that the non-DV service providers in our communities are serving an awful lot of survivors. So participating in the COC is really a chance to increase referrals to your program and to increase understanding about the clients that we're serving. The very best COC boards have multiple victim service providers and DV staff involved with them, and when the process is working the best way it should, the DV community is using that platform as an opportunity to provide training around domestic violence and trauma-informed care. You all should know that HUD requires that victim service providers are represented on COC boards, and that points are awarded in the NOFA application for collaboration. So your COCs want to see, HUD wants to see that your COCs are engaging you and that you're working, that you're involved in the COC process. So we believe that you should be participating in the COC even if you don't want a housing program. it's totally reasonable to think my expertise is serving victims of domestic violence and perhaps serving them most often in the shelter setting or in an emergency an emergency situation. But it's really important for domestic violence service providers to understand the housing services that are available in their communities, because so many of the survivors that we serve need housing. So participating in the COC is a way to expand the housing options for your clients. You can build partnerships and relationships with other housing providers who are probably very interested in providing, in offering, at least in our world, are interested in working with us and serving survivors of domestic violence. Excuse me. It's important. Another reason why it's really important to participate in the COC, even if you don't want to run a housing program, is because of the new coordinated entry system that all communities are now using to decide how housing services should be provided, or whom services should be provided to. HUD requires coordinated entry systems to have a policy on how they will address needs of these survivors who are seeking services from non-VSPs. So the coordinated entry systems have prioritization lists that determine who gets housing, and these coordinated entry systems were required to be in place by January 23rd of 2018. Is that right?
This year.
Yeah, this year. Okay, in place by January 23rd, 2018. So it's really important to know about the coordinated entry systems and to be aware of them so that you can help your survivors get on those prioritization lists, because that's how everyone is determined. That's how the COCs are deciding, or the providers are deciding, who gets housing. Okay. So maybe you've decided that you do want to design a high-scoring housing program. If you do, then it's really important that your housing program follow the priorities outlined in the NOFA. And they are that you must adopt a housing-first philosophy. We already talked about how you have to be participating in the coordinated entry system. You need to be funded at the Tier 1 level. We touched on this a little bit earlier. Your project should dedicate beds to chronically homeless clients. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to set beds aside, but you have to make a commitment that if you have chronically homeless clients you present, that you're going to serve them. A new project has to adopt those priorities in order to be funded. And a transitional housing project that seeks renewal funding that does not adopt a housing first philosophy will not be funded. So that's critically important. Finally, it's just imperative that data collection is happening consistent with HUD's data rubrics, and that your reports are submitted on time. So I mentioned before that projects have to be, that it's really good to try to make sure your project is funded in the first tier. HUD has two funding tiers, and the difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 is that COCs decide which projects are Tier 1, and those will be funded. When a project ends up in Tier 2, it competes against every project in the country. So when you're working in your COCs, with your COCs, and projects are ranked, it's always better if your project ends up in Tier 1. Last year we had a couple of our projects that were right on the end. They were Tier 2 projects, and they were at the bottom, or actually they were like in the middle of the second tier, the Tier 2, and they sadly were not funded. Okay, so now I'm going to hand the baton over to Andrea Miller, who is our KCADV's Economic Empowerment Project Director.
Great. Hey, everybody. So I want to just first start saying that Maria from the Pennsylvania Coalition is going to talk a little bit more in depth about the DV Housing First approach, because that's something that she has a tremendous amount of experience with her work in Washington. And so she's going to focus a lot about that. I'm going to share some of Kentucky's experiences with that, and just kind of highlight some of the things about Housing First. So the intent is that a program offers permanent affordable housing as quickly as possible, and then after the client is housed, provide voluntary services, those supportive services that would help that client then move forward towards self-sufficiency. And so the intent is to minimize shelter stay. That's what Housing First is all about. It's very low barrier at entry and exit. You are not screening out. We're actually trying to, you just take people where they are, house them, and then work on issues. And then it fits very closely with voluntary services philosophy that we have in our world, with our DV world. And so I want to say a couple of the things about this, that some of the transitional housing programs, our programs, KCADV programs, lost funding in earlier years because they didn't use Housing First. So we want to make sure that we are training our advocates. We're still emphasizing this concept really strongly, Housing First versus Housing Ready, to our advocates, and working with our advocates on developing those kind of strong assessments and case planning tools that are client-driven. That case plan, you want it to be client-driven. And we tend to focus a lot on harm reduction and motivational interviewing as the best methods to work on those issues. We're very focused on voluntary services, so we really want to encourage building that rapport with clients so you can have a real active engagement that doesn't have any coercion involved, so that you can ensure that the person is successful in their housing, there's a good relationship between that person and their advocate, and that we are seeing and hoping going to be demonstrating through some evaluation that we're doing with our housing programming, that there's increased success with stability and sustainability for our folks that are in our rapid rehousing. Forward. There we go. Okay, so with the HUD COC Program Outcomes, they're looking at the percent of clients that are exiting to permanent housing. That's their most important outcome. We all understand that. That's kind of a no-brainer. And then gaining or increasing income through employment or non-employment. For us, that's really at the heart of sustainability if you're working with someone in rapid rehousing. The intent is you take them where they are, and then we're working on a sustainability journey with that person. We've got 12 months in our project, and I'll talk more about KCADV's program, but we have 12 months in our project, but HUD only gives us 24 months. And as Mary mentioned earlier, sometimes that's just not enough. We're working with people who are experiencing extreme poverty. What they really need is housing that is affordable, and I think that I'm not the only one on this webinar that understands the difficulty of that. In Kentucky, we face that. We have a tremendous lack of affordable housing in some of our communities, especially housing that will pass the Housing Quality Standard inspection, which is a requirement if you're using HUD funds. So one of those things that we're working on with that is ensuring that we're working on with our clients on finding affordable housing that they can sustain, or that we're working systemically to transition that person to a permanent housing voucher. And that's working with the local PSA or with Kentucky Housing Corporation that handles 87 counties for housing choice vouchers in Kentucky. So we have a preference set aside for our survivors who have been in our rapid rehousing program for at least 12 months, then we can turn in a preference for them, which bumps them up on the wait list for a permanent housing choice voucher. So we're, again, trying to attack this in different ways to reach that permanent outcome that a person, if they can't go to market rent on their own, that there's a way that we can help them still stay housed after our rapid rehousing dollars have run out for that family. HUD also is looking at utilization rates. Just want to make sure that grantees are focusing on the hardest individuals to serve, and that you're utilizing your dollars from your grant at a rate that shows that you're going to spend that down. And another thing that they're looking at is the length of stay in permanent supportive housing. So I think I'm kind of done there. And with the focus on those HUD priorities, with domestic violence DV programs that don't score well on outcomes, you can make up a difference by working with your COC to influence the grant scoring process. So in Kentucky, KCADV, Mary mentioned this earlier, KCADV, our executive directors of our 15-member programs, we have all been sitting at the table on this from the beginning, and we continue to sit now. We're actually talking about it for this NOFA with scoring committees that are coming up, and we want to look and make sure that our projects, our programs, that the outcomes that they're using to score those programs, it is something that's achievable in the domestic violence world. And so our scoring committee, I highly recommend that you're involved in that with your local COCs, that you're involved with the scoring of how that's developed. HUD has a template, but that's not a requirement. And so a lot of COCs will take those templates and they'll design their own scoring process. So the whole intent of this is that you want to be part of that so that you can make sure that your program needs are going to be considered. So for example, I'll just say that with the Kentucky Balance of State, we had some clients that, or programs that lost funding, and it was because, well, they lost funding. And so one of the things that we wanted to look at was with the transitional housing programs, we knew that sometimes it took longer for those individuals to make a transition to permanent housing. So they were staying longer with those services, which was reducing the score because they were staying longer and receiving services. So what the adjustment was that we worked to add points for those programs if they were serving that population, so the youth transitional housing. I hope that makes sense. And some of the other things that we were looking at is having some of the scoring criteria meet more of the domestic violence needs. And that was looking at things like no income and things like that. So again, looking at some of those housing first principles, if we're serving those folks, then we shouldn't be penalized for using those principles in the scoring process. So that was one of the other things that we were dealing with. So let me talk about our project. So KCADV administers 2 grants actually. We have about 73 clients, families that are on our program right now. Most are renting from landlords across our state. We are serving the balance of state, so that's 118 counties. About a dozen or so live in some units that KCADV built with tax credit housing dollars, and those clients chose to live in those units. That's an important piece. And KCADV, at the coalition level, we determine eligibility, we complete all the required forms, and we work the contract with our landlords. We also pay all the landlords coming out of our office. And our programs will provide case management and housing advocacy at the local level. And then we also have a part-time staff member here and our housing administrator, and they kind of bridge with the clients and the program advocates, and we're following up regularly from our office with our housing clients and our advocates to ensure that our families are getting the best service that they need to work towards that self-sufficiency. Everyone that's coming into our housing is referred through coordinated entry. That's a requirement. So we're really on board with starting up the coordinated entry process across the state. Our central Kentucky area has had the longest coordinated entry piece where they've been really following that, and the rest of the areas have been coming on board. And so when we're looking at coordinated entry in our state, the balance of state shows the VI SPDAT, which is a tool that you may have heard of, to prioritize people coming into housing. The rapid rehousing range is 4 to 7 for an individual, 4 to 8 for a family. And so what we look at is we look at that VI SPDAT score first. That score is posted anonymously for victims on the region for the COC. And then the providers, who are the people providing housing, and that's us, KCADV in our case, when there's an individual that either came through us or was referred to us, if they're at the top of the prioritization list, they are the ones that receive our housing resource if we have it, and that's how the housing piece starts. I hope that makes sense. But everyone has to go through coordinated entry, and that's the important piece, which is why it's important for you as a victim service provider to be involved in your coordinated entry, because you just don't refer people directly anymore. You go through coordinated entry, and then coordinated entry is set up to serve the person with the highest acuity first. And it's a change. It's very much a change that everybody, I think, is trying to get used to. For our coordinated entry, we're serving Category 1 and Category 4. Most of our persons are coming in as Category 4, which is actively fleeing DV. We do have some Category 1, which are people who are literally homeless. Those are typically folks that were staying in a DV program shelter at the time that they were put onto the coordinated entry list. Our households are less than 50% of the area median income, and our families, we primarily have families. About 64% of our clients are families, and 36% are single. I think they're almost, I would almost say it's 100% women, but I do know that we just recently leased up a couple of male victims. And our grant is specific to DV survivors, so our rapid rehousing, you have to be a DV survivor to access. About 38% of our clients get full rental assistance, which means that we're paying their rent, 100% of it. And then about 8% of our clients have zero income at the time that they come in. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the supportive services that we offer through our rapid rehousing grants. That is case management. That's one. Again, we have a part-time person here in our office, and then we also have our advocates locally. We're not paying them. Our local program is paying that advocate for case management. We have moving assistance, transportation assistance, utility deposits up to $175, and other services that could be available. We're not necessarily doing them because some of our partners are, but other supportive services that you could consider if you were going to do a rapid rehousing grant would be things like child care, education, food, legal services, some employment and job training programs, things like that. We tend to partner with a lot of agencies across Kentucky, so we're not paying those directly out of our grant. We're focused on moving, transportation, utilities. And then we also get from our Kentucky Housing Corporation partner, with our rapid rehousing grants, we have $10,000 that they give us for support, what they call homeless matching funds. And that's a really pretty amazing thing that they're offering us, because it could be for things that are not included in your supportive services. It's almost unrestricted what you can use it for in terms of helping your victims. So we tend to use that as an emergency fund to help victims. And I will say this too, KCADV also has a flexible funding program. We call it Purple Purse. And that we tend to use for all kinds of things to help survivors with self-sufficiency or moving towards their goals. And so we use these homeless matching funds that we get from Kentucky Housing Corporation in that same way. And so it could be things like some help with a car repair, or going back to school expense for a person. They need to be able to stay in school, and so this needs to be something covered, and they don't have another resource for it. Those are kind of, having to deal with transportation is the biggest one. That's a huge barrier in Kentucky to begin with. And so transportation costs are typically where we spend most of that funding. And our economic empowerment programming is also something that our families have access to, and that includes match savings programs or individual development accounts. We have 3 of those running right now. We have one that you can do home ownership, post-secondary education, small business. We have a car IDA and a short-term match savings IDA that we've designed to help people start to build emergency savings. Then we also offer microloans to help people with building credit, and we do credit coaching as part of our economic empowerment project, and we offer financial education classes on basic concepts like understanding credit and how to use it, avoiding predatory lending, setting up a budget and working a budget, things like that. I think the last things I wanted to share about this information is that with our program, most of the time our average emergency request is about $227, and our average rent is $611, and the average subsidy that we pay is about $512. So with our project, I've just shared a lot of information about that. Some of that was not on our slides. And I'm happy to talk about that if you want to give me a call or an email about any of the things, because it's a lot of information. We do offer that full rental assistance for 12 months. We offer the security deposit, damage deposit, if that's what you want to call it, and we have utility deposits, as I mentioned, up to $175. If someone has a utility deposit that's more than $175, then we can fold that difference over into our homeless matching funds or our flexible funding that KCADV operates. So we definitely want to make sure that that damage deposit, that utility deposit, is not keeping someone from getting housed. We do have the option for longer assistance after 12 months. So really, at day one, we start looking at how are we going to get this person to full market rent, or how are we going to get them to permanent housing in 12 months. And we literally start at day one, planning the exit. And then at 6 months, we're even stronger looking at where are we with this family? How is this going? What's happening? And then we're, again, looking at kind of like that time clock that's counting down. So as the person approaches that 12-month time frame, we already know if we're going to continue them on because their advocate is saying we need more time, or that's really it, we need more time. And so we can give them, again, that additional time after that. That's about 50% of the folks that we're working with for sure. We also do deposits when we're working with landlords. We will offer a larger security deposit, sometimes maybe the equivalent of 2 months' rent, and this is to kind of build a relationship with landlords. It's a strategy that we're using both with rapid rehousing, and we actually learned it from our programs that were operating their permanent supportive housing. That was something that they had said, hey, this really works for us. You can try it. And we're like, sure. So we go. Our serving on the CoC board really helped us with some of the things that we're talking about here. Again, I think some of the other things that I wanted to mention is that we do serve on the Balance of State Advisory Board. We're not a voting member. We're like we can just be there and we can share what we want to share, and it's taken into consideration. We also attend all of the LPC meetings that we can. We are specifically focused in Central Kentucky because that's where we're located, so we'll go to that meeting, but we also want to know what's happening in the other LPCs. So we are on what's called Base Camp, which basically allows us to be in communication with the other 5 regions in Kentucky about what's happening with the LPC.
Explain what LPC is.
And the LPC, is the Local Prioritization Community. And so representatives from our member programs also go to their LPCs at their regions. And we don't really have any survivors yet that have been on our representative at the LPC. We do have homeless persons that are on, who are part of the community. But I'm not for 100% sure if any of those are survivors. I'm not aware of that. And I want to talk a little bit about some of our exits so far. So we've had about 38 people exit our program, and about 24 of them actually went to permanent housing. We had 10 people, I'll use the term ghosted. That's kind of the way we see it. They disappear. We don't know what has happened. Their advocates don't know what's happened. We sometimes get a call from the advocate or sometimes from the landlord, and it just says the person's gone. We've had 2 people exit after multiple housing attempts that were not successful. And so that's kind of our saddest outcome right there is for those 2. Except for the 2, I should say this is the sad one. We had 2 people that passed away. We had a victim who was killed by her perpetrator. That was the worst one that we've had so far. But that's kind of statistically where we are. We're pretty pleased with those outcomes so far. Again, we're also evaluating the project to kind of see how we can make it even better than what we're seeing. So we've talked a little bit about these outcomes. I feel like that got flipped. All right, so with our rapid rehousing program, I mentioned before that we have one full-time administrator in our office. We have a half-time caseworker in our office. The majority of their salaries are paid through our rapid rehousing grant. We tend to focus on trying to sell our program, if you will, to the landlord. We want to bring more landlords into our circle. And we're not trying to sell them on renting to a particular client. We want them to recognize the value of this program and be invested in this program with us. So we've got a briefing book that's in development right now for our landlords that we're working on issuing. It'll be in the next month and a half. We started it a bit ago. We talk to landlords really regularly. And so we really feel like that this will be another way for us to just get information about our program out into the communities. We're also, like I said before, we're building that strong landlord network because we often are working with a survivor who actually might want to relocate, or we have someone who is not really familiar with what's available in the community, and we often get the question of, well, do you have a list of landlords that I can talk to or that I can work with? And we're developing that, but we also want it to be not just a list. We want to really develop a relationship with the landlord so that we know that when our client is renting at this landlord, from this landlord, that they're not being victimized any further by some kind of really not so great landlord. And so that's something that's really important for us. The last thing I want to talk about on this slide is the data collection. We use Osmium, WS. We submit our data as a rapid rehousing grantee. We go through our collaborative applicant partner, who is the Kentucky Housing Corporation. We find that Osmium, we think it works well. I know that there's good and bad with any kind of data systems, but we're always working. We have a data collection specialist here at KCADV who troubleshoots a lot of problems and is working with our programs and with us. I will say that for our rapid rehousing program, we enter all of the data here at KCADV. We pull all the data from KCADV on our rapid rehousing clients. So we're not collecting information from our member programs that we're then compiling together and then submitting. We actually enter everybody in at our office level, and then we run the reports that way. And I will tell you, if you are going to do data entry and you are going to do a grant like this, I highly recommend that you have one person do your data entry. Our programs will tell you the same thing. If you have too many people entering things in there, it messes things up for you a little bit. And I'm just sharing this as a personal story. Highly recommend that you have one person that does that training for you and enters that information for you. It's the best way for you to pull out clean reports, which, as Mary mentioned, those reports that you turn in on a timely manner are important in your project and the scoring that will happen with it. So I think we've used up all of our time, I hope, and I'm going to turn it over to Maria, and she's going to talk about the experience that she's had with the Joint Component and Rapid Rehousing project.
Hi everyone, my name is Maria Williams and I'm the Housing Specialist at PCADV. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about choosing a program model. You just got a lot of information about how the COCs work and how HUD brings money through those COCs, and it's really important that you all in programs look at how specifically what's going to work for your community. Not necessarily what the COC thinks will bring in the most points, but what really do survivors need and what's going to work for your community. Those are the things that are going to produce the outcomes that will guarantee that programs get funded. So we're going to look at choosing a program model, then specifically what is the joint component, and I'll explain that a little bit, and then give a case example of an organization called LifeWire, which is in Bellevue, Washington. And full disclosure, I used to work there very recently, so if you have any questions, I'm happy to point you to people there, and if you have any questions about housing in Pennsylvania, pretty soon I'll know your answers. So In choosing a program model, the most important piece that you can bring forward first is what survivors actually need. This is easy to come by because many of us have offices that are near to where survivors are living or in the same building that survivors are living in, and they want to tell you how they're feeling about their housing, and they want to tell you what's working and what's not. I think, and as a former housing provider, what I know is that it's easy to not ask those questions because it often feels like you don't have the resources to make anything different. And that's the really exciting thing about the DV bonus, is it allows for organizations to apply for resources to make things different for survivors. So don't be afraid to ask the survivors that are in your services about what is working for them, given the current housing options that you provide, and then what they feel is missing, both from your organization and from the community. It's really insightful to hold a focus group and buy some dinner and sit and talk with everyone about if they could live anywhere in the community, where would they live and what would that look like, and really begin to build things off of what survivors are actually identifying that they need. The second piece in choosing a program model is looking at the identification of community needs. So as Mary and Alicia were saying, it's really, really important to know your COC leadership, and I can't emphasize that enough. They'll be able to help you understand what's needed in the community and what pieces in the COC are missing or are lacking. It's also important to build relationships with mainstream housing programs that aren't set up to serve domestic violence survivors, but we know are anyway, and find out what's working for them. And when they think about what survivors need or what other members of their community need, what's missing. And then the other important component is looking to other domestic violence programs in your community, in your COC, or even outside of your COC, but in the region that you're in. The King County in Seattle, or in Washington State, which is where Seattle is based, is a great example of this. The programs there are very collaborative and are working on a number of collaborative projects together. One of the reasons that LifeWire applied for the Joint Component Funds is it was something that was missing in the domestic violence community in King County. And there were other domestic violence organizations doing other forms of housing. This was one that was missing. So it made sense as a community project, and having that sort of support come in around a new project is really important. When you're choosing a program model, then you also need to look at your own organizational strengths. So the first thing to look at is infrastructure. In rapid rehousing, it's important that you're able to cut checks quickly and often. And so do you have a finance department or an accountant, or however your organization does that work, to be able to cut checks quickly based on what survivors are needing? Alicia talked about sometimes paying increased deposits to make sure that survivors can get into housing they may not otherwise be able to get into. Oftentimes finance departments or accountants have to turn those checks around within 24 hours. Is that something that your organization can do? Does your organization own a facility? Untangling all the contracts that exist on a facility and in programs and then selling a facility is a huge undertaking. You may want to figure out how to develop a program that uses the facility you have, or you can get funding to create some new structure within the facility to be able to provide services in ways that survivors are asking for them to be provided. But taking into account whether or not you have a facility is very important. Another great example of infrastructure is, does your organization work with landlords in the community? Getting a rapid rehousing program off the ground is much more difficult if you've never worked with a landlord before. And then the other important piece of this to look at is what sort of people do you have at your organization? Do you have the administrative support it takes to build a new program and be creative with housing programs? That is everything from your finance to people that write grants to your facilities and maintenance individuals. And I know for smaller programs, sometimes those can all be the same person, and that makes sense. And then it's important to think about what your capacity is. Does your organization have the executive support that it needs to be creative with housing projects? It's really great to think about building new housing for survivors. And part of that is making sure that your executive director and that your board is really behind the idea that your organization is going to go out and do something different based on what survivors are identifying that they need. KCADV gave great examples of using flexible funds to meet survivors' needs quickly and to make sure that there's enough funding coming in to really get down to what survivors need and make sure that they can stay in housing once they've obtained it. That's really moving away from the traditional model of shelter and transitional housing, and that's where the housing community is going. So based on that, it's important that your board of directors and that your executive director or CEO is really understanding what this means and how exciting it is and what risks you're going to have to take, and that your organization is at a healthy point in its culture to be able to take risks well. Another important piece, and I've seen this happen with organizations that have implemented both mobile advocacy and rental assistance work, is thinking if you've never done it before, it's a big lift to make sure that you have the systems in place to be able to do rental assistance work well. Rental assistance work often happens in people's apartments. And in fact, most usually, and best practice shows it should happen where the survivor identifies that she or he would like to meet. That takes extra technology, it takes transportation for advocates, it takes all sorts of things that aren't typically built into what we've identified as domestic violence advocacy. And so you really need to think about what those different components are and how you can build them in. That's something I'm happy to talk with folks about too, if you're interested in moving toward rental assistance and employing mobile advocacy. My contact information is in the slide deck, and I'm happy to speak with you about that. I also want to caution or encourage folks that if your organization doesn't have all of this infrastructure and all of these people in place and all of this support and a great relationship with the COC and people on the board and even understanding what Tier 1 and Tier 2 means and all of that, don't let that keep you from trying something new and from looking at how the joint component and rapid rehousing can really be fantastic options for survivors. And again, I'm happy to talk through that process with you on an individual basis. So what is the joint component? This is directly from the NOFA. The joint component was developed by HUD as a way to meet survivors' needs. As I've been saying, many survivors have identified both the need for transitional housing and for rental subsidies in permanent housing. In transitional housing programs that I've worked in, oftentimes we see that a drop in the ability to maintain permanent housing after a survivor has moved out of a transitional housing facility or even a shelter facility, that time spent in homelessness, in communal shelter, or some sort of hybrid living situation really doesn't prepare them to be able to live in the way that they would like to live independently on their own, that sort of thing. So it's important that HUD has taken this step to understand that both transitional housing and rental assistance are important because that's what the community is identifying as needed. The other thing that the joint component really does for domestic violence service providers is allow for a housing first philosophy and model to be implemented within transitional housing. When I was working at LifeWire and other transitional housing programs that I've worked in, it's very prescriptive, oftentimes, transitional housing is, and I know that I have felt dissonance between that prescriptive nature of transitional housing and then housing first services and philosophy, and then services that are built on housing first models in juxtaposition to what's happening in transitional housing. So Mary had said that I was going to talk a little bit more about DV Housing First, and the DV Housing First approach is something that Housing First is required in these HUD applications, and it was developed by the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and it focuses on getting survivors of domestic violence into stable housing as quickly as possible, and then providing the necessary support they need to rebuild. And that's from documents that the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence has produced. And if you're interested in learning more about the DV Housing First model, you can go to WSCDV's website, and they have a whole toolkit and a lot of information there about DV Housing First. So if you're familiar with the mainstream or traditional Housing First model, the real difference is DV Housing First shares those same tenets. The real differences, though, is focus on community engagement and systems change, knowing that everything from working with landlords to working with housing authorities to making sure that eviction laws don't encroach on the rights of survivors, that's all an important piece of making sure that housing is stable for survivors, because otherwise we're just working to fix things on a person-by-person basis, which is important. But that systems change work is really a tenet of the Housing First, of the Domestic Violence Housing First philosophy, because we want to make sure that systems can work for survivors. And then an additional piece that the DV Housing First philosophy has added is trauma-informed practice. So I know that we're all familiar with trauma-informed practice, but the idea that survivors can best heal from DV when basic needs are addressed, and then that trauma can show up in all sorts of ways that may look to us like people are being uncooperative or rude or non-responsive, but what we know is that trauma affects people in all sorts of ways, and that doesn't make them undeserving of housing. So it shares the same ideas with the Housing First, with traditional Housing First then, and that housing is a basic human right, that we have compassion and respect and warmth for folks that we work with, a commitment to working with survivors as long as they need, and then a focus on permanent housing, but more importantly, a focus on making sure that options exist for survivors, that it's not just shelter and it's not just permanent housing, but it's asking survivors really what they need and how they can best be helped. That's a great piece of what the joint component does, is it helps give survivors options. So a case example is LifeWire in Bellevue, Washington. And LifeWire is the largest comprehensive domestic violence organization in the state of Washington, and was part of the original DV Housing First cohort developed by the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. LifeWire has had a transitional housing program for many years and focusing on serving survivors that are dealing with substance abuse. That was an underserved population, still is an underserved population in King County and in most places across the United States. And that focus on making sure that survivors that were dealing with addiction had a place to go, and it was safe, and it was supportive, and it wasn't based on them being sober, was very important. What we heard from survivors in that program is that they loved the fact that the transitional housing program existed, but it wasn't enough. and that they wanted to be able to move themselves and their children into permanent housing in the community and still have the support of LifeWire. We also heard from the staff that work at the Transitional Housing Program that they were focusing on things like who took my milk from the fridge rather than how can you be safe because you know you're going to court and your partner is going to be there. And we know as DV advocates that we want to be focusing on safety and self-determination and making sure that coercive control is eliminated from survivors' lives rather than focusing on who took my milk from the fridge. In communal models of shelter and transitional housing, this is a common problem, and the joint component was a great option for LifeWire because it did have that building, but also had a long history of providing rental assistance, and that's really what both the staff and survivors were identifying was needed. LifeWire has provided rental assistance for many years, has done rapid rehousing programs with a variety of partners in the community, and so had the infrastructure and people set to do that work, and so they were able to lift the rapid rehousing program, portion of this program pretty quickly. As well as having a really high-performing transitional housing project, most of the exits, I think it was 85% of exits were to permanent housing from the Transitional Housing Project. They also have a really good relationship with the leadership in the COC. The joint component is new, and so in that it can feel risky. So being willing as an organization to go out on a limb with the support of the COC leadership really makes projects like this possible. I also want to make sure that folks understand that this is a 24-month program, and as Mary Alicia was saying, that often is not enough. But the exciting thing is that it's 24 months potentially for rapid rehousing, which as rapid rehousing has been rolled out across the country, there's been all sorts of limits put on how long a survivor or a participant can be served in rapid rehousing, and we know from HUD that this is a 24-month rapid rehousing program. So you can't be in both transitional housing and rapid rehousing for 24 months each, but the total of the program can be 24 months. So at LifeWire, survivors enter into My Friend's Place, which is what the Transitional Housing Program is called, through DV coordinated entry. In King County, the providers there, the domestic violence providers there, are working on building a parallel coordinated entry system. And if folks are interested in talking about that, I'm happy to. I was part of that planning process and can refer you on to people that are currently working on it. That decision was made because of the large number of housing programs that exist in the King County area and in that COC. Survivor advocates felt that they could best help survivors get into housing rather than relying on mainstream systems to do that work. So they can come in through domestic violence coordinated entry, they can be self-referred, or they can be referred from an advocate or from a community partner. As I was saying, this program specifically supports survivors that are dealing with substance use. So many treatment providers in the community refer into this program. Then the survivor can choose between transitional housing, which at LifeWire is facility-based, or rapid rehousing, which is a lease in their name. If a survivor is unsure of what route is going to be best for her or him, the advocates at LifeWire have developed a housing stability tool that they use to have a guided conversation with a survivor about what is working for them in housing, what has worked in the past, looks at what their debt is, what their income is, and really what option is going to be best for them. And then from that information, oftentimes survivors can make that decision. I know that there was some conversation earlier about the prioritization needing to be a move into permanent housing, But what we know is that there are many survivors that, because of safety reasons, because of all sorts of other things that are happening in their lives, that something prior to permanent housing is really what's going to work best for them. It is so important to let the survivor that you're working with identify that for themselves. So once that decision is made, the advocate helps the survivor move into the transitional housing facility or to locate a rental unit. The survivor can move from transitional housing into rapid rehousing as soon as they want to. There's no time limits or readiness tests as in accordance with the Housing First model. And like I said, the program can last in total up for 24 months. But the important piece of it, too, is that advocacy can last as long as the survivor identifies the need for advocacy. And really, the key to making this work is a strong advocacy relationship. So far, what LifeWire is seeing as the strength is that it's allowing DV Housing First philosophy and practice to be centered in transitional housing, which was new for them and exciting. The focus on survivor-identified needs and the advocacy relationship rather than limits of facility and a tight housing market, which are often the things that come up when you're looking at barriers to housing models. And then also the joint component application was encouraged both by the COC and the DV community, supported by LifeWire executive leadership and board. So it was LifeWire was really primed and ready to go for this model. The challenge is that it was the first joint component application in that COC, and that, we as a community really like to know what each other is doing and see what has worked and what hasn't, and it was a big risk to take this on without having any sort of model to base it on. There was no new staffing in the budget for this program, and so they were having to run rental assistance and housing search and that sort of thing with the existing staffing from the transitional housing facility. There are a number of things that have made that complicated, but it is working. It has been challenging, though. And then I think when you're starting a new program, organizational change is always challenging, and it's always hard to really dig in and figure out how you're going to do this new thing and roll this new thing out when you have so many other things calling for your attention. So I think those have been the biggest challenges that LifeWire's faced. So this is my contact information, and if you'd like to talk to me more about the joint component, I'm happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for your presentation and for Kentucky as well. At this point, we have a few more minutes left. We have about 15 minutes left for Q&A, and there's been a lot of active chat discussion in the chat box. So if there's any questions out there that you want to ask, it looks like there's been a lot of response in real time. And it looks like people have gotten their questions answered in real time. I will answer really quick Tom's question around clarifying that the THRRH project is eligible for funding under the $50 million bonus project. Yes, if you are, it's a new project, so it's new bonus money. So you would be eligible to apply for the joint component project for transitional housing, rapid rehousing, the combo project. That's one option. The other option is for supportive services only coordinated entry. So that is to apply to do policy-related work to set up a coordinated entry system that is, and to work closely with your COCs on their coordinated entry processes to make sure they're inclusive and accessible to survivors. And the third option with the DV bonus money is rapid rehousing. So you can apply for one, two, or all three, and it just really depends on the funding allotment in your local community, what the ratio is, and how you want to distribute your funds and what the need is locally. So Jill has a question about what database programs have the agency used that are HUD compliant. That is a can of worms, but I can just say generally there's some databases out there. Kentucky mentioned using Osmium Women's Shelter. That is a database that is compliant with the VAWA regulations, and it's up to your local continuum of care, your balance of state, to determine what is a comparable database. They'll vouch for that, but we do here at NADV do a lot of work with our safety net team around ensuring that comparable databases that you all use are VAWA compliant, and that you all as agencies own the data and it's not owned by a third party, or that your vendor, your software vendor, doesn't have access to it. So you can go to our Safe Housing Partnerships website. We did a comparable database webinar series with Texas and Iowa, and then we also did a general one, how to choose a comparable database. So you can go to our Safe Housing Partnerships website and listen to those, and they've been recorded. So yeah, if you get this funding, like was mentioned, you will need to have a comparable database to be able to aggregately, is that a word, aggregately, to provide an aggregate report to your HMIS folks and HUD folks. And the slides, and yeah, I'll be sending out the slides and everything to everyone once the webinar is over. Have you guys seen Mary or Andrea or Maria? Are there any questions floating out there that you all want to answer, or anything still in the chat box?
I think we used Mary's computer to answer most of the questions that we thought we could answer. If we missed any, now would be the time to re-ask it, or
So there's a question for permanent supportive housing, and yeah, you are correct. That is not one of the options under this DV bonus, the new $50 million money. That is not an option for this new funding. So no, do not apply for permanent supportive housing under this new DV bonus project funding. If you're currently getting PSH money, it's up for renewal. You can renew it, or if there's reallocations you want to do, that's separate, from the current pot of money that your COC has. But for this new money, no, they absolutely do not apply for permanent supportive housing with this money.
there was.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Debbie, I think that there was a comment about someone who was curious about the coordinated entry component available under DV bonus, which is the supportive services only coordinated entry piece, and what COCs or agencies are planning for those types of projects. I know in Kentucky we don't have anybody, none that is, as far as we know, interested in that piece, because that piece is mostly designed to actually run your LPC. So a lot of our victim service providers aren't really interested in being the lead agency for the COC. We do have one that is, and that's in Bowling Green, Kentucky, but that's what those funds are typically for. And we haven't had anybody that's kind of stepped up and said we want to be in charge. So. I don't know if any other coalitions have any other experience with that.
This is Maria. I know that in King County there was talk about applying for these funds to help develop a parallel system. So I think that that is one thing that the funds could be used for, and could help with infrastructure development and that sort of thing.
That's a great point, Maria, I think. We're not using parallel systems here, so, but I've heard several other states that are, and that's a great point.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities that coalitions want to think about having some sort of housing policy person, when I think about victim service providers, both the local jurisdictional level and at the state level, there's always a need for leadership to keep the ball rolling on procedures and how things are moving along, because there's always going to be changes with how services are delivered or changes at HUD. So it's really beneficial to have a policy-related person that can go and attend those meetings and really be a presence that's consistent, because we're all spread pretty thin, and especially in local agencies. So yeah, and creating a parallel system is definitely something that would be eligible for under the supportive services only category. I don't see any more chat box activity. I think it's slowed down quite a bit. Is there anything else that the presenters that you'd like to share before we could wrap up a little bit early? Give everyone 10 minutes. Is there anything else?
No, thank you for this opportunity, Debbie.
You're welcome. Thank you all for your great work. So I'll go ahead and we'll officially close it out. And so that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you all for attending and all the great questions in the chat box. On behalf of NNADV and the Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, I want to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I wish everyone lots of luck during your HUD NOFA application process. And just to give a quick plug too in terms of timing, I mentioned this on yesterday's webinar, the local jurisdictions and the balances of state, the COCs, are in the process of asking the providers and entities to apply now. They do the pre-application process in local communities. So it's very pertinent and timely for you to contact your COCs immediately to get connected to them to talk about this funding and to be able to apply. And then they apply in September is the due date for the NOFA application, but they apply after they've coordinated and organized all the applications from the entire community or state for the balance of state. So time is of the essence if you're interested in applying for these funds. And then we're all a resource, and the Kentucky Coalition and the Pennsylvania Coalition, we're all resources as you apply and go through this process as well. So we'll send out the PowerPoint from today's webinar for you to reference and to share with your colleagues. And you can also find it on the Safe Housing Partnerships website, and there's additional resources about the intersection of DV and housing and homelessness. So thank you all and have a great day.
Bye. Bye.